Alberta school book ban turns into a major controversy and a major fiasco for the government. Plus, a fascinating new book examining Canada's gun control debate and the unique history and nature of Canada's gun culture. All that and more straight ahead on episode 28 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. All right, greeting friends, and welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us. A lot to get to on this episode. Let's dive right into the big story in Alberta over the last week. And it concerns schools, it concerns books, and it concerns the debate over which books should be in which schools and how we make the determination around what is age appropriate. The Alberta government, of course, had embarked on a policy to try to get graphic, explicit sexual content out of schools, but that approach has backfired. After last week, we learned of the books that were to be pulled within the Edmonton Public School Board. Now, a bit of the background on this, and this goes back to earlier this year, back in the spring, when the Alberta government called attention really just to 4 books specifically, and these are graphic novels specifically. So we are talking in this context about some of the images as well as some of the content in these books. One is called Genderqueer, and this has been at the center of some controversy in other jurisdictions. Particularly, it's interesting if you go back, I was reading a piece about the 2021 governor's race in the state of Virginia. And the presence of this book in some schools turned into a huge controversy. In a lot of ways, almost kind of tipped that race to the Republicans. So Genderqueer it's a memoir, it's a graphic novel. That's one of the books. Blankets is another. Flamer and Fun Home round out this controversial 4. So the Alberta government called attention to the presence of these books in some schools in Alberta. Now, initially, they didn't say where exactly, but they were concerned enough about the content that they launched this whole process. Now, they could have perhaps just quietly said to whatever schools had these books that perhaps you shouldn't. Again, depending on which schools they were in or what ages had access to them. But they decided to turn this into a much bigger policy approach regarding sexual content. Now, look, in fairness, you look at these books and some of the content in these books, it is very controversial. Certainly, I think this is not material appropriate for elementary school students. If it's appropriate at all in schools, and maybe that's even still debatable at this point, you would expect that would be exclusively for high school students. But initially, it was about these 4 books. But rather than just say, again, these 4 books shouldn't be in schools or shouldn't be in elementary schools, the Alberta government launched a whole process saying we're going to make sure that explicit sexual content is not in schools. And whatever content is age appropriate. So that brought us to July when there was a ministerial order that went out outlining how all of this was going to work. Explicit sexual content was to be removed from all schools, all grades, all schools, all across the province. Now, there was another category for non-explicit sexual content that could perhaps be in schools if it was age appropriate. Primarily, that was intended to be in high schools. So this was all spelled out in the ministerial order. That went to school boards, and they were given until October 1st to comply. So that meant that they had to go through the thousands of books in their libraries, catalog it all. Also, by the way, books that were, or materials that were in classrooms too. So there was a lot of work that had to go into that to make sure that it complied with the ministerial order. And they had until October 1st to do so. Now again, it wasn't a list of books that school boards had to remove. It was a set of criteria for determining which books counted in which category. So again, explicit sexual content, as defined in the ministerial order, had to be removed altogether. So last week, we learned that the Edmonton Public School Board had completed their assessment and compiled a list of about 200 books that were to be pulled in order to comply with this ministerial order. Look, the Edmonton Public School Board didn't send this out to the media. They didn't have a big showy press conference to announce this. The edict or the list went out to schools, and inevitably it was leaked to the media. So we all learned very quickly as to what books were on this list, and it was quite an outrage, quite a controversy. Why are we pulling all of these classics from schools? Was that the intent of what the Alberta government was trying to do here, or how did it get to this point? And so that brought us to the debate we got into this week. whether this was the Alberta government overreaching with its definition, whether somehow this was the Edmonton Public School Board inappropriately or wrongly interpreting this ministerial order. So how was it that we had books, from Margaret Atwood or, classics like Atlas Shrugged or Brave New World, or even books like Jaws or It, or the graphic novel Watchmen, being pulled from all schools in the Edmonton Public School Division. Now, initially, the premier, the education minister, kind of lashed out at the Edmonton Public School Board, accusing them of vicious compliance with this ministerial order. But eventually, the Alberta government retreated and said that they were going to pause the ministerial order so that it would be made more clear for school boards what the whole purpose of this was. And honestly, that's what needed to happen here. The problem was not what Edmonton Public School Board did. The problem was the wording of the ministerial order. The definition for explicit sexual content was spelled out in this ministerial order, and all of these books that Edmonton Public School Board intended on pulling met that definition. So it's a little weird to criticize the Edmonton Public School Board for complying with the order, because I'm sure they would have been criticized the other way if they had decided to give books a pass, leave them in libraries, even though they met the definition for content that shouldn't be in libraries. So this criticism of Edmonton Public Schools seems a little weird to me. They complied with the order. If it ended up pulling books that we didn't want pulled, then the problem is the order, not what Edmonton Public Schools did to comply. No one really who has criticized the Edmonton Public School Board has explained how exactly any of these books were wrongly pulled. So it's almost like we all seem to concede that, yeah, okay, they technically did meet the definition of explicit content. So where does that leave us? Anyway, so this was the premier speaking on Tuesday. So this is after the pause in the policy was announced, so that a new ministerial order could be written to better clarify all of this. So here's what Premier Danielle Smith had to say.
The direction will be to take books with pornographic images out of the libraries and to leave the classics alone. I think that there was some misunderstanding of the order, so it's being made clear, and the Minister of Environment is going to be making that very clear through a new ministerial order. We have, for the third time, also published the graphic images in the books under question that have been available to children as young as elementary school. So hopefully this third time around, as we repost those images with warning, because they are very graphic, we are hoping that the school boards understand what it is we're trying to achieve.
Premier, when could we expect to see a full, updated list on which books are or aren't being banned in public library or school libraries?
Well, what I would say is as I mentioned, it's images that we're concerned about, graphic images, and I'll have we were hoping that the school boards would be able to identify those on their own and work with us to try to make sure that pornographic images are not being shown to young children. Clearly, we have to be a bit more directive on that. So the minister is going to look at the list of books that Edmonton Public identified, and then we'll be able to give more clear direction. But with the ministerial order that he's reissuing to focus on pornographic images with examples really and titles of at least 4 books, I'm hoping that will give pretty clear guidance to the school boards of what it is we're looking for. If they need us to give them more clear guidance with a more comprehensive list of the images that we're concerned about, then I'll work with the education minister on that. But we're just not interested in seeing a new book list published every single day that is purposely misunderstanding what it is we're trying to do. What I would like for the school boards to say is, we agree, children shouldn't see pornographic images. We'll work with you on that. And that's what I hope the new spirit going forward will be.
Okay, so there's the Premier's explanation as to what's going on here, what they intend to do. It really needs to be emphasized that as much as the Premier talks about images, the ministerial order that went to all school boards does not specify images. When it comes to the definition of explicit sexual content, there is no distinction made between images, between audio, between video, and what's written. There is no distinction made. So the idea that school boards were supposed to focus on images Well, that would contradict what's in the ministerial order because there's no distinction made between images and what's written. Again, if the Alberta government wants the focus to be on graphic images, then that's something they need to make clear. Look, if they've got a list of books they don't think should be in schools, they should be the ones compiling the list. And if they've got specific criteria then they want school boards to use in the future, then they need to be really clear about what that entails. This ministerial order was not. Again, these books that were pulled, including, by the way, Atlas Shrugged, which the Premier has identified as a favorite of hers. The Premier has even said in this debate that maybe Atlas Shrugged should be mandatory reading in high school. Like, you can't have it both ways. You can't create a set of criteria that stipulates that books like this should be banned and then at the same time say that it should also be mandatory reading. And if you've got yourself in that situation, then perhaps the problem is the way you've gone about this. So yes, I think it's important now for the Alberta government then to clarify all of this and to make this a little more specific, a little more focused, and frankly, more reasonable. Because the way this ministerial order was written was not reasonable. And it led to this. So it's not really the fault of the school board for complying. Ultimately, it's the fault of the ministerial order and the way in which it was written and what was expected of these schools. Now, again, the Alberta government is focused on these 4 graphic novels that we mentioned earlier, and they actually ended up releasing a list of the schools it was found in, because initially they said they didn't want to say so. So as it turns out, these books were exclusively found in schools in Edmonton and Calgary, mostly in high schools. Now, the Premier talked about elementary school students, and in fairness, look, there were no elementary schools in which these books were found, but there were a few schools where I think they were either K-12 schools or K-9 schools. And that's a tricky thing for schools, especially when you have that wide range of ages, in ensuring that content is appropriate for the age of the students accessing it. When you've got it all in a library, how do you manage that? And of course, that's where school librarians are supposed to come in to the equation here. So we'll get a different perspective on all of this and find out the role that librarians are supposed to play in all of this and how we navigate some of these tricky things. Where you've got content that might be age appropriate for 16 or 17-year-olds, but certainly isn't appropriate for 8 or 9-year-olds. And that can be sexual content. That could be a lot of other different kinds of categories. Because it's interesting, you've got these kind of censorship impulses coming from the left and the right in this debate. I recall a huge debate a couple of years ago in Ontario in the Peel School Division, because they were pulling books, what they called a weeding process, where books that were of a certain age, like beyond a certain date, were being pulled. And one of the concerns that the school board has was the content insensitive or not in keeping with today's standards? Or could it be seen as discriminatory or racist or exclusionary in some way? And so all kinds of books ended up getting pulled, like The Diary of Anne Frank and other classics. And there was this huge outrage. Like, this is kind of left-wing censorship run amok, because a lot of this is classic literature. You don't want blatantly racist propaganda going into schools. But just because a piece of classic literature maybe isn't politically correct by today's standards doesn't mean it should be banned from schools. And I think you see some of this coming from the right as well, the idea that no sexual content should be in schools. I don't think that's reasonable. Anything that's graphic or pornographic certainly shouldn't. But you look at some of these books that have been controversial, like The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which was one of the books on the Edmonton Public School Board's list, that's been banned in other school districts, primarily in the United States. And primarily that push coming from, the right, from social conservatives, as well as some of these other books that do have some sexual content. So where's the line when it comes to that? What's appropriate when it comes to these classic works of literature? And making sure that if this is going to be something that students have access to, or books that are even required reading in some cases, that it is age appropriate. So the Alberta government made a huge mess of this, honestly. At the end of the day, this is a mess of their own making. And I think they saw this maybe as a political win potentially, because, well, for one, look, I think these books were called to their attention by certain groups that wanted to make this an issue here because it's been an issue elsewhere. Let's go out and see if these books can be found in certain school libraries. Oh, look, there they are. let's make a big show of it. So the Alberta government went along, and I mean, A, it keeps those groups happy. But B, I think, it would be hard for most people to defend the presence of these specific graphic novels in certain schools, certainly for younger grades. So who is going to object to this? I think parents, even those that are not socially conservative do have concerns about what's going on in schools, what's my kid being exposed to, or even the idea that maybe they're being indoctrinated to some extent or being exposed to things that I don't really want them exposed to. So this kind of played on some of those fears or concerns. But the way in which they went about implementing this policy, it became a huge fiasco. It went, I think, well beyond any reasonable attempt to make sure that inappropriate content wasn't present in schools. So we'll see what they come back with, and what kind of policy ends up resulting from this whole process, and whether it's something that's reasonable, understandable, simple enough for school boards to implement, and maybe we can move on to some bigger issues in Alberta. There's a lot we're dealing with as a province right now, even when it comes to schools, a potential teacher strike or lockout, a growing population, schools kind of bursting at the seams, in addition to all the other challenges we're facing right now as a province. Debating whether Atlas Shrugged or The Handmaid's Tale should be in high schools just seems like a really weird distraction from all this other stuff. But like I say, it became a huge issue, even international coverage around all of this, and not favorable, I would argue. Kind of embarrassing for the province of Alberta and how this all played out. All right, well, joining us now for some further perspective on this whole controversy, how this all played out in Alberta, but also to talk more specifically about the role that school libraries play, the role that school librarians play when it comes to kids accessing certain materials. Very pleased to welcome to the podcast Joseph Jeffery. Joseph is chair of Canadian School Libraries, more at canadianschoollibraries.ca. Joseph, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
It's good to be with you, Rob.
I suppose some relief that at least the government is backing down or changing, I guess pausing is what they're saying with regard to this policy, but just your thoughts on how it got to this point in the first place.
I wouldn't quite characterize it as relief. The minister and premier have sort of made it very clear that this is a very temporary pause to deal with what they are characterizing as vicious compliance with it, although we would argue that it was very poorly worded in the first place and there wasn't really another way to interpret it other than the way that Edmonton did when you're being asked to consider all the things that were being asked. We are hoping that when it comes back, it will be worded in such a way that it will be very clear what the intent is, and that the stated goal of it being just about pornographic images will be what this is around, rather than the, let's go with coded announcement that the minister made back in May, which seemed to imply this was equally about LGBTQ books as it was about sexually explicit books, and equating the two regardless of whether or not they were sexually explicit.
It was interesting to hear the government suggest that Edmonton Public Schools should have reached out to them or worked with them around this. I mean, it seems that maybe going back to May, there was an opportunity for it to go the other way, right? The Alberta government could have reached out to school boards and reached out to experts and said, let's work together and come up with some policy. But it's been pretty top down from the Alberta government, hasn't it?
Yes, and there have been attempts to reach out to them and talk to them about it and offer expertise. The Library Association of Alberta did reach out to the minister and try to offer the expertise of librarians to support and make sure that this came across in the way it was supposed to, rather than what they were attempting to do. Those were, as far as I can tell, rebuffed. There was no attempt to reach out to any of the school districts or to any library professionals, teacher librarians, public school librarians or otherwise, to try and make this work.
Yeah. And the practice of implementing this, I mean, the Alberta government brings down the ministerial order in July. School boards have until October 1st to comply. We're talking about going through thousands of books and other materials. And again, the definition for what's explicit, the definition for what's supposed to be pulled, I mean, it's spelled out in the ministerial order. It makes no distinction between words and images. So, I mean, it puts the school board in a really tough spot, doesn't it?
Yes, and it specifically mentioned that in the ministerial order it was regardless of print or visuals, and that it included both implicit and explicit sexual content. And so when you have such broad definitions and you're trying to apply them equally across K to 9 and then 10 to 12, it becomes a Herculean task that these school boards were only given approximately 2 months to do before school came back, and then you've got no time in September to really do this. Anyone who's worked in schools knows that right. September is the most frantic month of the year as you try and get students up and ready, start your programs. There's not really the time to do something like this then. And this was the biggest school, or one of the biggest school boards in Alberta trying to do this. I don't know how the smaller ones were ever meant to do this task.
It is interesting in all of this. It's almost like we've ignored or forgotten that school librarians exist. Like somehow school libraries are just this free-for-all where all these books are sitting there and young kids can go in and peruse the content that's intended for older students. So what do you make of the fact of how this has been framed, or that we've kind of overlooked the role that librarians play here?
Well, to a certain extent, there is a little bit of a free-for-all because there isn't librarians in Alberta. The school librarians have been cut back so severely over the last few years. We can only locate 10 of them, less than 10 of them in the whole province. That is not a sustainable number for a province of Alberta's size. Most of those are at the high school level. At the elementary level, you have library clerks who sometimes have training, sometimes don't, but are otherwise just regular educational workers who've been told to work in the library and try and check out books, and they're doing the best they can, but they are not trained in the same way that a teacher librarian is. We have to do significant amount of training. We have to have a master's degree, or a graduate diploma in librarianship. It isn't just a role that we take on off the side of our desks. And part of that is learning how to select and deselect material. And so when you're asking people without that kind of qualification to make these distinctions, you are going to have mistakes. But the other problem is, looking through the online catalogs that are publicly facing, we haven't been able to find a lot of the egregious mistakes that were part of that original ministerial order. They're not in the schools as far as we can find. And so it leads the question of, well, if they're not there, where was this coming from? And where was this data coming from that this was a terrible situation in schools where students were, as young as 5, were having access to things like all boys don't wear blue, or blankets, or anything like that. It really wasn't there.
It is a challenge, obviously, though, to determine, what belongs in school in the first place, because there are classic works of literature that have sexual depictions, that have foul language, or even what we would view today as racist language. And then there's the whole question of, well, if something is appropriate in school, where do we draw that line in terms of what's age appropriate? And it's, I suppose, at some level, inherently subjective.
There is a little bit of subjectiveness to it, but there are widely held expectations to what is developmentally appropriate at different, what we call planes of development. And there's always going to be students that outlie those planes of development, which is one of the reasons we use those rather than strict age, because especially when you get into comparing two students who are the exact same age, everything from the exact month and day that they're born in can really factor into a student's development. So you can't just really use age. You have to sort of rely more on the broader developmental planes. But even with that, there is a limited amount of subjectivity to what is appropriate for students. And we have, over the years, through networks of teacher librarians across the country, and public librarians and academics, become pretty good at figuring out what is and isn't appropriate for particular age groups. And so you won't find a lot of books that don't have a significant educational role in a school library, because we've had those conversations either internally within our groups within provinces, nationally, or even internationally about what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate, and how we make those distinctions.
What's the role then the government has to play? In Alberta, I mean, education is provincial jurisdiction. The Alberta government does come up with overarching sort of standards for education. So when it comes to this kind of specific issue, is there a role for government to play?
So I'm speaking to you today from British Columbia. And in British Columbia, our selection and deselection is delegated out to the individual school boards. And then the individual school boards will delegate that down again into the people that they have trained to do this work. They won't make sweeping bureaucratic decisions, because there's the role of the educators within most of our provinces is seen as this is work that you have to be trained to do. Just like you wouldn't try and take on the role of a doctor or a lawyer or any kind of other professional, generally speaking, without understanding it. You don't want to jump into something that you really need to be versed in. Now, that's not to say that governments don't have a role in education at all, but generally speaking, from working with other provinces, while the minister themselves is a political appointee, most of the department underneath are educators and former educators, and generally there is some level of communication between the minister, the political appointee, and the ministry, the educational experts, to guide policy and guide decision makings and work with school boards to develop those. I know, again, in BC, we have many avenues for information to get back to the ministry from school boards. There's a lot more, as far as I can tell, interaction between the different levels. And so there is almost a two-way conversation between those political entities and the ones who have the expert knowledge to do the job.
So something, falls through the cracks, or there's a particular concern and it's brought up by a parent or it's brought to the minister, that there can be an avenue for conversation, a way for the minister to approach then schools or school boards and say, what's going on here? What's the situation? Some concerns been raised about a certain book or some kind of content.
So challenge processes exist in every school district, and in most provinces, they're a mandatory part of the policies of a school board. The challenge process will outline who can challenge a material. Usually it's either residents of the school district or people with students inside the school district, either parents or guardians or caregivers, plus the employees of the school district. It's very important from our end that challenge processes exist, because the public does need a avenue to be able to say, no, this is not appropriate. There will be mistakes that happen. I remember in my first year, I bought, as a teacher librarian, I bought this book that was meant to be just like Harry Potter, and didn't do enough research into it, and it was a bit too adult for the elementary school. It was flagged pretty much immediately upon entering the school, and we sent it off to the high school. But if the parent hadn't had that opportunity to go, actually, I think you've got this wrong, you should probably not have this in schools, that's a problem. And so that challenge process enables you to go through those steps. And usually the steps are, you'll try and talk to the school librarian or someone in charge of the library. Then you'll try and talk to the principal. And if you can't resolve things at the principal level, then the principal will ask you to initiate a formal challenge, and the book will be sent off to review by a third party within the school district, following criteria that has been developed for that purpose to make sure that it is an educationally sound material. And then that will come back. Sometimes the panel that will review it is one person, especially in smaller school districts. In larger school districts, it might be 2 or 3 people all making a review. And that process, as I said, is very important for us to have. But what we're seeing in Alberta is an attempt to subvert that process and do that top-down from a governmental level rather than going through the steps. And a lot of it seems, is to do with the ministers meeting with Action for Canada, who have these lists of books they want out of schools. And they have tried in multiple provinces going through that system. And because they're not residents of the school district, or they don't have kids enrolled in the school system, they're told, no, you can't challenge. Or they have tried challenging and been told, no, these books can stay.
We'll see where Alberta goes from here as we await a revised policy. Much more is mentioned, CanadianSchoolLibraries.ca. Joseph, really appreciate your insight on all of this. Thanks so much for making time for us here.
Thank you very much, Rob.
Once again, that was Joseph Jeffery, Chair of Canadian School Libraries. So some interesting perspective on this whole debate in Alberta and that question of how this whole matter of content needs to be handled by governments, by school boards, by individual schools. So again, we'll see what Alberta decides to do here in terms of a revised policy, but it's pretty clear the policy as it was originally written and implemented is what led to this whole mess in the first place. Maybe a silver lining to this whole mess is a more reasonable conversation about these issues. The bigger context too, though, we're concerned about kids having access to material that's sexual in nature or, even racist in nature. Think about what kids are carrying around with them every single day, right? Their phones. And what's on social media, the kinds of graphic, extremely graphic sexual content that's available, or the horrible hatred and racism that's available out there. So kids are going to be exposed to things they shouldn't be exposed to. I don't know if school libraries are the biggest source of that. I would argue that what they can find on their phones is. Now, that's not to say that addressing these issues in terms of libraries and books and content isn't important, but I think we also need to recognize if we're concerned about kids' well-being, we're concerned about what they're being potentially exposed to, things they shouldn't be exposed to, things that could be detrimental. Maybe there's a broader conversation about phones and social media and the internet and everything that kids are having to navigate and parents are having to navigate these days. But it certainly has all raised some very interesting issues, as much as the Alberta government certainly botched the implementation of this. So we'll stay tuned for further details. Still to come on this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show, we'll shift gears to another controversial and at times emotional debate, that around gun control and gun policy. There's a new book that takes a look at the debates, a look at the gun movement in Canada, and trying to understand why things are different in Canada than they are in the United States, even if at times there's a perception that some of this overlaps. when it comes to the gun debate, gun culture, gun lobby groups, there's a whole world of difference between Canada and the United States. And so this is a book that also explores those differences and tries to understand then, well, who are these individuals and groups that have pushed back against some government policy, most recently, of course, the government's ban on so-called assault-style weapons. Noah Schwartz is with the University of the Fraser Valley. He's the author of a new book. It's called Targeted: Citizenship, Advocacy, and Gun Control in Canada. Conversation with Noah Schwartz coming up next on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Well, we are seeing debate rage once again in Canada around gun control as a Liberal government attempts to implement new gun control measures and being met with some fierce resistance by Canadian gun owners. There's an important and timely new book looking at some of the aspects of the gun policy debate in Canada, in particular, trying to better understand Canada's gun movement, gun rights movement, and understanding the uniquely Canadian gun culture behind it. The book is called Targeted: Citizenship, Advocacy, and Gun Control in Canada. Joining us on the podcast is the author of the book. Noah Schwartz is a professor of political science at the University of Fraser Valley. Much more at noahschwartz.ca. Professor Schwartz, great to have you with us here.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
And I think, as I say, this is a pretty important issue and important for Canadians to understand the context around this debate. And what's interesting, too, is maybe where there's a need for a book like this, because it seems to be quite a void in Canada when it comes to research on gun policy.
Yeah, that was, as I started researching this issue, about 5 or 6 years ago now, it's certainly a void that I noticed and was quite surprised by, because we hear about guns, we hear about gun control a lot in the media, but when it comes to sort of deeper, longer explorations of the issue, when it comes to books about it, there's a huge gap in the literature, which is, obviously what scholars look for. That for us, that's an opportunity. So I was able to, step into that opportunity, and I'm really excited that the book is going to address some issues in some communities that really haven't gotten much coverage.
Right. And what do you think that's needed? Why do you think that's important?
I think it's important because the issue of gun control is so important, right? It's one of those political issues that's literally a life and death issue, but it's one that's not well understood by Canadians in general, at least on the Canadian side. I think Canadians have a very good sense and understanding of the American gun debate, once again, because it's just so prevalent in media narratives and in the news. But we really don't know, most Canadians, I should say, really don't know very much about what gun control laws look like in Canada, what the Canadian community of gun owners that I speak to in this book looks like, or why Canadians want to own guns. There's a quote in the book from former Toronto Mayor John Tory, who literally asked, "Why does anyone in Toronto need a gun?" And I try to answer that in the book because I think it's an important and relevant question for policy debates and discussions.
It is interesting. When we talk about gun culture or those that stand up for gun rights, I think, as you say, we're really affected by what we see south of the border, just the influence the groups like the NRA have and the extent to which they want policy to be shaped, because it's really different in a lot of ways in Canada, the extent to which gun owners are prepared to accept a consensus, and just even the history and the nature of gun culture here, it really is unique.
Certainly, yeah. I think, since the 1990s, there's been a pretty powerful consensus in Canada around gun control. Most of the, gun owners that I spoke to and interviewed in the book, which is just about 100 people, they were, for the most part, okay with Canada's gun laws as they existed prior to the changes made starting in 2019. They accepted things like licensing. So if you're going to be a legal gun owner in Canada, you have to go through the licensing process. You have to get a PAL, a position and acquisition license, or if you want something like a handgun or other type of restricted firearms, that's another additional license. So gun owners in Canada go through a lot of steps to be able to have the privilege of gun ownership. And for the most part, they were in favor of that because it helps, they know that this helps keep guns out of the hands of people that shouldn't have it. In Canada, we have safe storage laws, and most of the people that I spoke to supported those safe storage laws because they know that, I don't think anyone wants a child or an other unauthorized individual to happen upon a gun, which unfortunately, and tragically happens all too often in the United States. So that consensus that was forged out of the laws in the 1990s that emerged from the École Polytechnique shooting, and these are laws that were made both by a progressive conservative and liberal government. So it was sort of a bipartisan building up of these laws, were widely supported by gun owners before, of course, the changes started to come in 2019 that people felt were less connected to public safety.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and you mentioned, the comment from Toronto's mayor, and I think we've seen how maybe politically the Liberals have seen this as a winning issue in cities, which perhaps speaks to where there's kind of a rural-urban divide. And is that one of the facets of gun culture in Canada, is that there's a real rural sort of hunting component to it?
Definitely. And that's a big part of the book as well, is sort of delving into not just the urban rural divide, but the east west divide. So I think the Liberal Party, it didn't used to be this way. The Liberal Party used to have a fairly significant rural component and rural base. But in recent years, certainly they've really become the party of urban Canada. And I would say largely, Eastern urban Canada, maybe with the exception of Vancouver. And that creates political incentives for them to use gun control as a wedge issue, because in general, people in cities are less likely to know someone who owns guns, and then less likely to oppose increases to gun control.
Right.
So there's certainly a political component of this that's tied to the urban-rural issue. A lot of the people that I spoke to in my research were rural Canadians, and for them, guns are tied to either leisure. So they go to the range, they participate in traditional shooting sports like skeet shooting, like target shooting, or it's tied to their food systems. People that I spoke to were subsistence hunters. They rely on meat that they gather from hunting to be able to feed themselves and their families. So obviously guns are going to be a huge part of your life if that's how you're getting your food. And this includes Indigenous Canadians living in rural areas who are more likely to rely on subsistence hunting, especially in the far north. So yeah, guns are hugely tied into the urban-rural issue, and then the east-west issue as well, because we see higher rates of gun ownership in provinces like Saskatchewan, Alberta, and parts of British Columbia, outside of maybe the Lower Mainland. So there's this east-west component as well to it that I think feeds into a lot of the narratives in the debates on this issue.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned how some of these tragedies have been catalysts for this debate, like École Polytechnique, and now more recently with the Nova Scotia massacre. And I think the aftermath of any tragedy, it's important to understand how it happened, what went wrong, could it have been prevented. But there's a real emphasis oftentimes on gun policy. What do you see as similarities between the debate now versus the debate in the late 80s and early 90s, and where maybe there's now some differences?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think and this goes back to the way that we think about gun control through kind of an American frame,
Yeah.
because we often see discussions of gun control happening in the United States after there's a mass shooting, or the memory of mass shootings being used to advocate for gun control. I think most recently there was a CNN interview a couple of weeks ago where they actually created an AI generated version of one of the students who died in the Parkland shooting,
Yeah.
and did an interview with that was really controversial. But it sort of speaks to that way that the memory of mass shootings is a huge catalyst for mobilizing movements for gun control. That is part of the interest group system. I don't know if it often creates the best policy. I think in the United States, definitely there's a need for more gun control to be able to prevent things like this. In Canada, since the 1990s, we have very, very strong laws on the books that attempt to keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. And the Nova Scotia shooting is kind of proof of that, in that the shooter sourced most of their firearms from the US. Right. So these, it's important. Obviously, these case studies are useful for movements for gun control to push for changes. But when we're thinking about making the best policy, we have to look at the long term and look at the context around it, and not sort of just focus on these events, as important as they are.
Yeah. And so oftentimes, when we just had it in the U.S., a school shooting in Minnesota, and we learned afterward how easy it was for the shooter to go in and legally acquire that firearm. And those stories come up over and over again in the United States. That's not really the case here at all. As you say, the shooter in Nova Scotia had acquired these firearms illegally. And that's a big part of the problem in Canada when it comes to guns, is just, the guns that come in illegally or on the streets, et cetera. So right there, I mean, that's a pretty substantial difference, isn't it?
Definitely. In the United States, the only thing standing between someone and purchasing a firearm, if they go to a federally licensed dealer, it's often just a single background check at point of purchase. So if that person happens to not have yet committed a crime, that background check won't obviously have anything to pick up. If they go to a gun show, there are ways that we know obviously of circumventing the background check system. In Canada, that's not the case. You obviously need a license in Canada, a PAL, to be able to purchase a firearm, and you undergo what's called continuous eligibility screening. So if a gun owner in Canada commits a crime, then they'll be flagged in the system. The RCMP will show up and they'll confiscate their firearms. So there's much more robust and continuous protections in Canada that help prevent unauthorized people from getting their hands on guns. The very, very large hole in the system, of course, is that we share the world's largest undefended border with a country that has more guns than people. So unfortunately, there's very little that we can do to completely eliminate the supply of black market guns in Canada, just because of the America factor.
Which does seem to be mainly handguns, I think. But it's interesting, the debate we're seeing right now isn't really around handguns as much as it is around rifles, or what the government has called assault-style weapons. And it is interesting because when we talk about traditional hunting practices and lifestyles, I don't think most urban Canadians are too worried about that. But the idea of assault-style weapons, I mean, that sounds pretty scary.
Definitely, and that's because it was intended to. So it's a really interesting history of the term assault style rifle or assault rifle. It actually goes back to the Second World War. The militaries at the time, leading up to and at the beginning of the Second World War, were largely using rifles that used really large calibers. So these are things like 30-06, which now a Canadian hunter is going to use to hunt a moose. And they found that this was literal overkill, because most fights were happening within 100 yards. And having troops carry around this heavy, very powerful ammo wasn't very efficient. So they built new rifles that used smaller, less powerful cartridges, and that could fire in both a semi-automatic and a fully automatic manner. And they labeled these new weapons assault weapons. So this is a military term.
Right.
Gun magazines then picked up on it, because they said, hey, this sounds cool. We can use it to sell guns. So American gun magazines started selling, assault weapons, which obviously weren't fully automatic. They were only semi-automatic weapons. But, advertisers, truth in advertising doesn't always, there's blurred lines. And then in the 80s, this gets picked up on by gun control advocates in the US. They're very rightly frustrated with the lack of ability to regulate handguns in America. Handguns, if you look at the FBI crime statistics, by an order of magnitude are responsible for way more crimes and homicides than rifles writ large, let alone, what we call assault rifles or assault style firearms. So they're frustrated. They can't regulate handguns. So they figure, hey, we're seeing in these gun magazines these scary looking rifles. The public doesn't really understand the distinction between semi-automatic and fully automatic guns. Maybe we can use this as a way to generate momentum for gun control. And this isn't me, speculating. There's literally a document where they wrote this down. Josh Sugarman of the Violence Policy Coalition wrote this down, have it in writing. And so that really set the terms of the gun debate, because I think they were very effective in realizing that, these firearms don't look like the kind of guns that we would imagine a hunter going into the field with. And they look like they are, very capable military firearms, when that's not necessarily always the case.
Yeah, we saw the government sort of get itself into trouble over this, because they had said at the outset, we're not going after hunting rifles. But inevitably, it was almost impossible to avoid, because we're talking about semi-automatic rifles. There's not a lot of functional difference between what the government considers an assault style weapon and what otherwise is accepted as a hunting rifle.
Definitely. I call this the assault style paradox that the government got itself into. By using the term assault style, they're sort of conceding that this isn't really a technical designation. This is about what the gun. It's about the style. There's not a technical term that we can use to define this. If they banned all semi-automatic firearms, then that is going to touch on a lot of guns that are used by hunters. Probably the most common shotgun being used to take duck and geese in Canada are semi-automatic shotguns. Semi-automatic rifles are certainly used by hunters to hunt deer and especially problem animals, coyotes, for example. Where I live in Abbotsford, where the city calls itself a city in the country, about 70% of the land is farming land here. And a lot of folks have problems with coyotes causing trouble with their livestock or their animals. And semi-automatic firearms are pretty useful for hunting coyotes because they move really fast. So yeah, there's definitely a strong use case for semi-automatic firearms in the north as well, where people are facing threats from animals like polar bears, which are unfortunately they're very cute and cuddly, but they're also known to be a threat to humans. Semi-automatic firearms are very useful in that situation. So the government was in a quandary. They couldn't ban all semi-automatic firearms because that's going to risk irritating hunters. And for the most part, I think what the government learned with the long gun registry is that if they can keep hunters on the sidelines in the gun debate and just go after guns that are used by sport shooters and collectors, then they can probably win the battle. If hunters get involved, things get really hairy for the government. So they couldn't go full bore and ban all semi-automatic rifles. So they create this assault style distinction. But this creates the problem that you're banning guns while functionally equivalent guns, so guns that work in the exact same way, are still legally on the market. And, annoying people like me are going to point that out and make the government look bad. So, yeah, they found themselves they painted themselves into a corner using that designation. Which they then tried to resolve in committee with really disastrous consequences, with kind of an 11th hour addition to Bill C-21 that sparked huge pushback from an NHL hockey player, Carey Price, amongst others. They then pulled that back and made it applicable to future firearms. But once again, it's really not clear, what we're trying to achieve here.
And then coupled with that, this idea of a buyback program and the cost and the scope of this is still unknown. And that's just another layer, I think, of a problem here for the government in implementing this. Does it all speak maybe to this kind of going sideways on the government? Is this an example potentially of a failed implementation of major gun control policy?
I think definitely. I mean, if you look at it by any other measure, a similar ban in New Zealand in 2019 was carried out like within a year and a little bit. It's now been 5 years since the Ordering Council. The only firearms that have been collected have been those that are from stores. And those stores had a huge incentive to want to give those guns back to the government because they were paying to store them and they had to declare them as inventory in their taxes. So they were losing a considerable amount of money holding on to these guns, and they really wanted to give them back to the government. But the government hasn't collected any firearms from individual owners. They don't necessarily know how many of them are out there. They have some estimates, but a lot of these guns were non-restricted, so they didn't need to be registered. And there really hasn't been a concrete plan put forward for how these guns are going to be collected. So I think it's certainly there have been major issues with implementation of this policy. It shows, I think, that you really need a certain amount of political will and buy-in from the community that's being regulated for regulations to work. And the government certainly doesn't have that trust or that buy-in with the gun community. And I think this is also a huge sort of hot potato that Mr. Carney's government has inherited. I was watching the debates, and especially the debate in Montreal, and Mr. Carney was asked about guns, and you could sort of see he was repeating the party line, but his heart wasn't in it. I don't know how much he believes in this policy, but I think, there's a lot at stake in this for the party, and he's inherited a really tough situation, unfortunately, since Mr. Trudeau's government just couldn't get this over the finish line.
As we talked about, Canada doesn't really have its own version of the NRA. Like, you couldn't really argue that there's a powerful lobby group out there that's derailing this policy. I think what we did see, though, here was a real grassroots pushback against this policy, and that sort of speaks to the nature of the groups and individuals that you spoke to and profile in the book that kind of represents gun ownership in Canada.
Definitely. So a big part of not there not being a huge amount of books on gun control in Canada is that we don't really have an understanding of who gun control advocates are in Canada, and so it's really easy to kind of copy and paste that characterization of the NRA onto Canadian gun control advocates, and we see this happen all the time. The reality is actually pretty different. The Canadian gun pro-gun movement is not well resourced in the way that the National Rifle Association is in the United States. They are generally sort of small groups. They have maybe a few professional full-time employees, but for the most part, they rely on volunteers. They don't have, a big flashy headquarters like the NRA has, or a multi-million dollar kind of media campaign ability. And one of the most interesting parts of the book, I think, is getting to know who are the people that are advocating for guns in Canada and why. And a lot of the time, it comes down to these are people for whom guns are an incredibly important part of their life and their life either as part of their work or outside of their work. These are people who have hunted their whole lives and for whom hunting is a part of their family tradition. And when the guns that they used to hunt were threatened, they wanted to get involved in the fight. This is people who were sport shooters. There is a huge community of sport shooters in Canada. So these are people who compete in shooting sports, whether that's Olympic shooting sports like skeet and trap shooting, where you use a shotgun, target shooting, or also dynamic shooting sports. These are things like IPSC. So these are people that run in between targets and shoot at targets with handguns and semi-automatic rifles over a course of fire in competition. And these are people that have invested thousands and thousands of dollars into these sports, thousands of hours of their life. And now these sports are going to disappear because of this new legislation. And that made them motivated to either donate their time and their money towards this movement. What's interesting in Canada is that, there is this large, powerful grassroots movement. But one of the things that the book tries to explain is why they haven't had that same success. They seem to the movement seems to struggle where the American movement has, almost dominance of the gun control landscape. And so I was trying to explain that a little bit with the book by looking at, Canada's institutions, our constitution. Obviously, they're fighting on a very different battlefield than the American pro-gun movement.
It's interesting because you see in the U.S., a lot of the debates around gun control or gun rights involves self-defense. And I think that's less so in Canada, but it's been interesting over the last few weeks with a couple of high-profile cases where, a guy in Ontario was charged, even though he was defending his home, or he had a horrible situation where a homeowner was killed by home intruders. And Canadians are wondering about self-defense law and just that fear of what you do in a situation like that. Do you see any element of that self-defense debate linking up with the gun policy debate in Canada?
I think yes and no. The big part, I think one of the big restrictions is that self-defense isn't a legal reason to own a firearm in Canada in the way that it is in the United States. And I think this kind of creates a chilling effect in the gun community where, when a researcher comes in from the outside, they might not want to speak to a researcher about, whether they would use their gun in self-defense or not. And I understand that, right? There's legal consequences to this kind of discussion. In Canada, it's illegal to advertise guns as tools for self-defense. There's a lot of laws in place that restrict the parameters around which this conversation can be had. At the same time, I think what the incident, I think in Lindsay, Ontario showed is that Canadians are, even, non-gun owning Canadians are concerned about self-defense. And I think there's a certain element of that with the gun ownership debate. Like these are, folks that own guns for hunting and for sport shooting and for leisure purposes. But it's sort of a dual purpose tool. It's a a tool that you can use for leisure, but ultimately if things go very, very bad, it can serve another purpose. So I think to a certain extent it certainly plays a role. But as a scholar, it's really hard for me to get a sense of that empirically because for very good and obvious reasons, people really didn't want to talk to me about that.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. But it does speak to how complex the whole issue of public safety is, right? And you got the criminal justice side, you've got, smart gun regulation, I think that can be a part of that. And I guess it's worth noting, I mean, this book isn't about saying, this is good policy, this is bad policy, here's the solution to better public safety in Canada.
No, that's true. Yeah, the book is really to give, it doesn't touch on those prescriptive policy questions of this is what we do, this is what we shouldn't do. I think it's impossible for a little bit of that not to bleed into it. And it certainly addresses some of those contentious topics. But for the most part, it's really about understanding gun ownership in Canada and the political movement that comes out of that community of gun owners. Another interesting thing that did come up with regards to self-defense is the way that self-defense maybe looks a little bit different in Canada than in the US. We obviously have a lot more wild spaces in Canada than they do in the US, and people living in very, very remote areas. So where people did discuss self-defense, it was often self-defense against maybe four-legged threats rather than two-legged threats. I spoke to people, in the interior of British Columbia for whom, bears and large cats are a serious issue when they go out in the woods. And going for a hike with a shotgun isn't something that they would consider strange. A lot of these folks were sort of upset that Canadian handgun laws don't allow you to take a handgun into the woods in the same way that they do in the United States. So while they wouldn't advocate for, concealed carry so that you can go to Walmart or go shopping with a gun, they would say, hey, maybe we should allow people to have handguns in the woods because a rifle or shotgun can be kind of unwieldy when you're ambushed by a large predatory cat or a bear. So there is definitely the self-defense element in Canada is a little bit more complicated. And when you get into the northern communities, I think that's even more so because of that polar bear issue, especially.
Definitely. Well, the book is called Targeted, published by University of Toronto Press. More to your website, noahschwartz.ca. Noah, thanks so much for making some time for us here. Really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me and for letting me talk about the book.
All right, and our thanks once again to Noah Schwartz, Assistant Professor of Political Science, University of Fraser Valley. Again, his new book, it is called Targeted, Citizenship, Advocacy, and Gun Control in Canada. More on his work, again, noahschwartz.ca. That's where we will leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Also, our thanks to Joseph Jeffery, Chair of Canadian School Libraries. Some interesting insight on the whole book ban debate in Alberta, and I guess we'll see where that goes in Alberta and whether this comes up in any other province. We will have another episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show for you coming up on Tuesday. Also, a new episode of The Line Alberta for you on Wednesday. So you can go to robbreakenridge.ca, also alberta.readtheline.ca. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend. We will talk to you next week. Take care.